Hey guys, tonight we begin with a collection of disasters so impressively unfortunate that even medieval people, who already lived one bad decision away from catastrophe, occasionally had to stop and admit that events were becoming a little unreasonable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow journeys through history's strangest failures. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Ideally somewhere with a reliable floor. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's settle into tonight's story together. The year was 1184, and in the German city of Erfurt, a gathering of nobles, knights, bishops, and imperial officials assembled to settle a political dispute. On paper, it sounded important. In practice, it was a room full of powerful men attempting to convince one another that their opinions deserved more attention than everyone else's. Discussions stretched on. Arguments grew louder. Pride floated through the air almost as heavily as the smell of damp timber. Beneath the hall where these influential figures stood was a large cesspit, a detail nobody considered especially important at the time. History would soon disagree. At first there was only a faint creaking sound. It was the sort of noise old buildings make all the time, which is why nobody paid attention. The floor had supported meetings before. It had survived countless footsteps. It had endured years of neglect. Surely it could survive one more political debate. Unfortunately, the floor had reached a different conclusion. Without warning, the wooden structure collapsed beneath the weight of the crowd. Dozens of armored nobles plunged downward into the cesspit below. One moment, they were discussing imperial affairs. The next, they were discovering that gravity had entered the conversation. Panic erupted instantly. Men struggled to climb over one another. Heavy armor that normally offered protection in battle became a liability. Some survivors later described scenes of confusion so complete that nobody knew where to step, who to help, or how to escape. The more people struggled, the more difficult escape became. It was a disaster made worse by desperation itself. There were no heroic speeches, no dramatic final declarations, just a collection of important individuals trapped in circumstances so embarrassing that even medieval chroniclers struggled to describe them with a straight face. Among the fortunate survivors was the future emperor Henry VI, who reportedly escaped because he had been standing near a window. It remains one of history's more unusual examples of location determining destiny. Had he been standing a few feet away, the future of the Holy Roman Empire might have looked very different. Instead, he survived while many others did not. The disaster became known as the Erfurt latrine disaster, a name that somehow manages to be both completely accurate and deeply unfortunate. What makes the event memorable centuries later is not simply the loss of life. Medieval Europe had seen wars, famines, and epidemics. Death itself was tragically familiar. What made this incident stand out was the sheer indignity of it all. These were men who commanded armies and controlled territories. Yet in a matter of seconds, they were reduced to victims of poor construction, accumulated neglect, and a floor that had simply decided it was done supporting politics. History often remembers rulers for victories and achievements. In this case, it remembers a meeting that ended in a very different kind of downfall. Yet medieval history was far from finished delivering disasters. More than 3 centuries later, in the summer of 1518, The city of Strasbourg witnessed an event so strange that even today, historians still debate exactly what happened. It began with a woman known as Frau Trophäa. One day, she stepped into the street and began dancing. At first, nobody thought much of it. People dance for all kinds of reasons: festivals, celebrations, personal joy. The problem was that there was no festival. There was no music. There was no obvious reason at all. And most importantly, she did not stop. Hours passed, then a full day, then another. Witnesses reported that she continued moving despite exhaustion. Soon others joined her, some voluntarily, some perhaps compelled by forces nobody understood. Within days, dozens of people were dancing throughout the city. Then the number climbed into the hundreds. The phenomenon became what historians now call the dancing plague of 1518, though the word plague hardly captures the bizarre nature of the event. People danced until their feet bled. They danced through pain and fatigue. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others reportedly suffered heart attacks or strokes. The sight must have been deeply unsettling. Imagine walking through your city and finding neighbors, merchants, craftsmen, and strangers all trapped in a relentless cycle of movement they seemed unable to control. The authorities wanted to help, but their solution only made the situation stranger. Believing the condition needed to run its course, local leaders hired musicians and built stages for the dancers. It was an extraordinary decision. Faced with a crowd of people dancing uncontrollably, officials essentially decided to improve the quality of the dancing. Unsurprisingly, the plan failed. The music encouraged more movement. More people joined. What had already been a mystery became a larger mystery with professional entertainment. Eventually, a different approach was attempted. Many of the afflicted were taken away from the city and brought to religious sites where prayers and rituals were performed. Gradually, the outbreak faded. To this day, historians disagree about the cause. Some point toward mass psychological stress. Others suggest illness or environmental factors. No theory explains everything. What remains undeniable is that for several weeks, an entire city watched hundreds of people dance themselves into collapse while nobody possessed a convincing explanation. It was one of those moments where reality became stranger than fiction and remained that way for centuries afterward. While Strasbourg struggled with dancing, medieval Paris faced a more traditional form of disaster. Bridges in the Middle Ages were not merely structures for crossing rivers. Many served as miniature neighborhoods. Houses, workshops, and shops crowded their surfaces. Residents lived directly above flowing water, supported by timber, stone, and confidence. The arrangement saved space and concentrated commerce, but it also created risks that became increasingly difficult to ignore. One famous example involved sections of a heavily populated bridge collapsing under the combined strain of buildings, merchants, customers, and everyday activity. The failure came suddenly. Structures that had appeared stable one moment were falling apart the next. Homes tumbled into the river below. People vanished alongside possessions accumulated over lifetimes. For those caught in the collapse, there was little time to react. Water, debris, and panic arrived simultaneously. The tragedy highlighted a recurring medieval habit. People often built exactly where convenience suggested and worried about consequences later. A bridge carrying pedestrians was one thing. A bridge supporting entire rows of buildings was another. Every additional structure increased stress on the foundation below. Yet because the arrangement worked most of the time, concerns were easy to dismiss. Until, of course, they weren't. Survivors faced difficult choices. Some lost homes, others lost businesses. Families were separated in moments. Yet despite these collapses, the practice continued in many places. Humans possess a remarkable ability to observe a dangerous idea, watch it fail dramatically, and then convince themselves the next attempt will surely go better. Medieval bridge construction occasionally reflected that optimism. These stories reveal something important about life during the Middle Ages. Danger was rarely confined to battlefields. It existed in meeting halls, marketplaces, streets, and homes. A noble attending a political discussion, a woman walking through Strasbourg, a merchant crossing a bridge, none of them expected to become part of history. Yet history has a habit of selecting ordinary moments and transforming them into unforgettable lessons. Sometimes the threat arrived as war, sometimes disease, and sometimes it arrived disguised as a floor, a dance, or a bridge that had quietly reached its limit. As the centuries passed, people continued building, trading, celebrating, and believing tomorrow would resemble today. Most of the time they were right, but every so often, reality intervened with spectacular timing. And when it did, medieval chroniclers carefully recorded the results, leaving behind stories that remain astonishing even hundreds of years later. Because while technology changes and societies evolve, one thing remains remarkably consistent. Human beings continue underestimating just how creative disaster can be. As strange as collapsing floors, dancing crowds, and falling bridges might seem, medieval history still had plenty of disasters waiting patiently in the wings. In fact, some of the most frightening catastrophes were not sudden at all. They arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary parts of daily life. A meal, for example, a feast, a celebration, the kind of event where people gathered to enjoy food, conversation, and the comforting belief that at least for one evening everything was going according to plan. In medieval France, feasts were displays of wealth as much as they were meals. Long tables groaned beneath the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, wine, vegetables, and every luxury the host could provide. Nobles judged one another by the quality of the food. Guests expected abundance. Bread appeared everywhere because bread was dependable. Bread was familiar. Bread was perhaps the least suspicious object in the room, which, unfortunately, made it the perfect disguise for disaster. Across parts of Europe, grain crops were sometimes infected by a fungus known today as ergot. Farmers had no idea it existed. Millers could not identify it. Bakers unknowingly mixed contaminated grain into flour. The result looked perfectly normal. It smelled normal. It tasted normal. Yet hidden within it were toxins capable of causing terrifying symptoms. At first the signs were subtle. Someone complained that their hands felt strange. Another guest rubbed aching fingers. A third stared into the distance as though seeing something nobody else could see. Then the symptoms intensified. Burning sensations spread through arms and legs. Hallucinations appeared. Convulsions followed. Some victims described feelings as though their bodies were on fire. Others reported visions so vivid they seemed real. What had begun as a feast gradually transformed into confusion and fear. Guests who arrived expecting an evening of celebration suddenly found themselves trapped inside a nightmare no one could explain. Without knowledge of fungi or toxicology, people searched desperately for answers. Some believed they had been cursed. Others blamed evil spirits. Religious explanations became common because they were often the only explanations available. Entire communities sometimes suffered from outbreaks linked to contaminated grain. The suffering could last weeks or months. Some victims recovered. Others never fully did. In severe cases, circulation problems caused permanent damage to limbs. What makes the tragedy especially unsettling is its simplicity. No enemy army appeared. No building collapsed. No storm arrived from the horizon. Instead, danger entered through something trusted and ordinary. A loaf of bread, a staple food eaten every day. It served as a reminder that in the medieval world, not every threat announced itself dramatically. Sometimes, catastrophe sat quietly on the dinner table, waiting to be served. Yet if contaminated bread represented hidden danger, medieval architecture often represented visible ambition. Few buildings captured that ambition more dramatically than the magnificent Beauvais Cathedral in France. From the moment construction began, the project carried an almost impossible goal. The builders wanted height, not modest height, not respectable height. They wanted to create something taller than anything around it, a structure that seemed to reach directly toward heaven itself. The cathedral rose higher and higher. Builders pushed Gothic engineering to its limits. Walls became thinner. Vaults climbed upward. Massive windows filled the interior with light. Visitors entering the structure must have felt overwhelmed by its scale. Everything about Beauvais communicated confidence. It suggested that human ingenuity had discovered how to challenge gravity and win. For a while, that confidence appeared justified. Then gravity responded. In 1284, a large section of the cathedral collapsed. Stone crashed downward. Parts of the ambitious structure simply could not support the stresses placed upon them. Years of effort vanished in moments. The disaster shocked everyone involved. Yet rather than abandon the project, builders repaired the damage and continued. That decision perfectly captures something fascinating about medieval ambition. Many people viewed setbacks not as warnings, but as obstacles to overcome. If the cathedral failed, perhaps it simply needed adjustments. If part of it collapsed, perhaps the solution was better engineering. And so, construction resumed. Eventually, additional failures occurred, including the collapse of an enormous central tower. At this point, the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. The cathedral was magnificent, but magnificence alone could not negotiate with physics. Every attempt to push higher carried risks. Every success invited another challenge. Beauvais became less a completed building and more a centuries-long conversation between human aspiration and structural reality. Even today, the cathedral remains impressive. Visitors still stand beneath its soaring architecture and admire its beauty. Yet hidden within that beauty is a lesson. Ambition can create wonders. It can also create problems. Sometimes the same quality responsible for extraordinary achievements is responsible for extraordinary failures. Medieval builders learned that lesson repeatedly, usually while looking upward and hoping nothing else decided to come down. While cathedrals struggled against gravity, nature occasionally demonstrated that it required no assistance whatsoever when creating disasters. One of the most devastating examples arrived during the winter of 1362 along the North Sea coast. People living in the region were accustomed to storms. Wind and rough weather were facts of life. Dikes protected settlements. Communities understood the risks and adapted accordingly. Most years the system worked. Then came the storm later known as the Grote Mandrenke, the Great Drowning of Men. The weather deteriorated rapidly. Winds intensified. Waves grew larger. Water levels rose beyond expectations. At first, residents likely assumed it was another severe storm, dangerous but survivable. Then the defenses began to fail. Dikes that had protected communities for generations broke apart under immense pressure. Once openings appeared, the sea surged inland. Entire villages disappeared beneath floodwaters. Fields vanished, roads vanished, homes vanished. Families were separated in darkness and chaos. People who had gone to sleep believing they understood their environment awoke to discover that the landscape itself was changing around them. The sea advanced relentlessly. There was little opportunity for negotiation, little opportunity for planning. Water moved faster than information. By the time many communities understood the scale of the disaster, survival had already become the only concern. When the storm finally ended, the coastline looked different. Thousands of lives had been lost. Settlements that once existed on maps existed only in memory. One of the most famous casualties was the prosperous trading center of Rungholt, a place so thoroughly destroyed that later generations described it almost like a legend. Stories emerged claiming church bells could still be heard beneath the waves on stormy nights. Whether true or not, such tales reflected the shock people felt when entire communities vanished. Unlike fires or wars, flood disasters often leave survivors facing a painful reality. Buildings can be rebuilt, crops can be replanted. But when the sea permanently changes the shape of the land itself, recovery becomes far more complicated. Maps must be redrawn. Lives must be reorganized. The familiar world no longer exists in quite the same form. The Great Drowning of Men demonstrated something medieval people already suspected, but rarely witnessed on such a scale. Human beings may build walls, dikes, roads, and cities, but nature remains perfectly capable of ignoring all of them. It does not require armies. It does not require politics. Given enough wind and enough water, it can rewrite geography all by itself. And yet medieval history still had one more lesson waiting. A lesson involving an emperor, a river, and a reminder that even the most powerful individuals are occasionally defeated by the most ordinary obstacles imaginable. By 1190, Frederick I, better known as Barbarossa, stood among the most respected rulers in Europe. He was Holy Roman Emperor, leader of armies, veteran of countless political struggles, and one of the central figures of the Third Crusade. His campaign had progressed surprisingly well. He guided a massive force across difficult terrain, maintained discipline, and achieved successes that impressed both allies and enemies. Then he encountered a river. The river itself was not especially famous. It was not an enormous obstacle. It was simply part of the landscape. Yet history has a habit of hiding major consequences inside ordinary circumstances. Accounts differ regarding exactly what happened. Some sources claim Frederick attempted to ride across. Others suggest he entered the water for different reasons. What remains consistent is the outcome. He fell. Heavy armor and moving water form an unfortunate combination. Once the emperor lost control, rescue became difficult. Despite efforts to save him, Frederick drowned. One of the most powerful rulers in Europe met his end not during a dramatic battle or heroic last stand, but during a river crossing. The consequences extended far beyond the tragedy itself. News spread through the crusading army. Morale collapsed. Soldiers questioned the future of the campaign. Some abandoned the expedition entirely. Leadership weakened. Momentum disappeared. A single accident transformed the direction of an entire military effort. It remains one of history's most striking examples of how quickly circumstances can change. Frederick had survived political intrigue, warfare, and decades of leadership. Yet in the end, a river accomplished what countless enemies could not. The water continued flowing afterward exactly as it had before, indifferent to titles, crowns, and imperial authority. And perhaps that is one of the recurring themes connecting all these stories. Whether discussing poisoned bread, collapsing cathedrals, devastating floods, or drowned emperors, the lesson remains remarkably consistent. Human beings love certainty. We enjoy believing that plans guarantee outcomes and experience guarantees safety. Medieval history repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. Sometimes a fungus hides in grain. Sometimes a building reaches too high. Sometimes the sea decides to reclaim the